So today we are going to cover a variety of no code ways that you can make your nonprofit's website more accessible. But before we get into the weeds, just want to take a quick minute to clarify what we mean when we say the word accessible in this context. So website accessibility just means making your website more available to all of your visitors, regardless of their ability. Just making sure that they can use and understand your site. And basically means making sure that folks with hearing or visual or mobility or cognitive disabilities can get the most out of their experience on your website. And the goal is really to provide the best experience to the most people we possibly can. Now, web accessibility is a massive topic and there's a lot to cover. So, we're going to focus specifically on the highest leverage ways that you can make your website's content more inclusive, more accessible without needing to call it develop. There are a lot of other sort of ways we can talk about website accessibility. It's possible we'll do more presentations on web accessibility, but that's the specific angle we're going to be taking today. And again, really an emphasis on no code ways that you can go implement quickly on your website. So first off, we're going to talk briefly just about why accessibility should matter for every organization. We sometimes hear from nonprofits who say something to the effect of our work isn't really in the disability rights space. So accessibility isn't a primary focus for our website. Now, you all are here today, so I'm guessing you're probably a little bit more bought in on accessibility than just the general public, but just because you're on board doesn't mean you're not going to hear pushback from other people within your organization, maybe someone on your leadership team or a board member. And so hopefully this will just equip you to push back on anyone that challenges the importance of accessibility for your organization. So, a few quick things to highlight here. First, in 2023, the World Health Organization estimated that 1 in 6 people worldwide live with a significant disability. That's 1.3 billion people with a 1.3 billion. That's just a whole lot of people to exclude from using your website effectively right off the bat. And then the second piece here is that ability is a fluid identity. It's not an identity that's set in stone. It can change over time. And I think this is actually an aspect of the accessibility conversation that's easy to overlook. Just because someone is able-bodied today doesn't mean that they necessarily will be tomorrow. You may have a major donor or a member of your staff or a board member who just may not be as able-bodied tomorrow as they are today. And by building your website with accessibility in mind, you're really just helping to ensure that you're going to continue to provide a great experience for everyone in your current community down the road, no matter what life throws their way. I think of it almost as a form of just future proofing your website to make sure that you're going to continue to provide a great experience for everyone who has joined your. Next, temporary and situational barriers. With or without a disability, you've probably been in situations where accessibility mattered. Like, I think illustrating this with an example is sometimes helpful. So let's take a common accessibility tip, like putting captions on a video. Like, yes, it absolutely supports folks who are deaf or hard of hearing who may be using your website, engaging with your content, but it also makes it possible for someone who is scrolling on their phone in bed to watch a video without volume and without picking up their partner, or maybe someone is in a loud space and can't hear the audio very clearly. While accessibility definitely means making your website available to more visitors, it also just means making your website available in more situations or more circumstances or more contexts where various barriers may exist. And I think this is more important than ever, just given the boom in people using their phones to browse. And the last point here is accessibility just sends a very clear message that everyone is welcome as part of your movement. Like beyond the practical side of people accessing your content, it just shows that you're intentionally designing your movement and your spaces to include folks who may have different needs. And I think that's something that most organizations would say they're trying to do. And also just something that feels more important than ever right now, just given the sort of context that we find ourselves in. Being intentional about building inclusive spaces can go a really long way in making folks feel welcomed and celebrated and appreciated as part of the movement built. All right, now we know why accessibility matters, and we can articulate the why, right? Like we know it helps you create truly user-friendly websites that provide a positive experience for everyone who visits. So now let's talk about how we can actually put that into practice. How can you make your website content more accessible to all of your visitors? Thankfully, there's a set of universal guidelines that exist. It's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. You'll hear it called WCAG sometimes for short. And this is just sort of like the standard that folks follow when it comes to ensuring accessibility. We're not going to get into the weeds because it does get kind of technical, but the thing to know about the WCAG guidelines is that there are 3 different levels. So there's single A, double A, and triple A. Single A is essentially the bare minimum of accessibility. It basically, like, without single A compliance, some folks just won't be able to use your website at all. Now, double A is really kind of the most common level. And this improves the usability of your website in a pretty substantial way for a wider range of folks with disabilities. And double A is the level that's most commonly cited in laws internationally, not only here in the United States, but internationally. And so double A is generally kind of like the standard that most organizations are shooting for when it comes to compliance. Triple A is the most robust level. This is one of those, it's great if possible kind of things, but full compliance is actually a pretty heavy lift. So typically the way we think about it is AAA compliance would be reserved for parts of the website that are serving a pretty specialized and specific audience. You know, if you're building tools specifically for folks with disabilities, it could be helpful to dive into that AAA level to make sure that you're doing everything you possibly can. But the steps we're going to cover today mostly fall into that single A and double A bucket. Now, yeah, are there more things you could do? Absolutely. There definitely are. But even what feel like relatively simple changes can make a big difference when it comes to improving the accessibility of your. All right, so let's actually dive in. The first tip here is to use proper image alt text. So a couple things to unpack here. First of all, what is alt text? So alt text is short for alternative text, and it's used by assistive devices like screen readers to describe how images appear or function to visitors who can't see them directly. So obviously critical for folks who are blind or have low vision, but it's also helpful in situations where images don't load due to internet connectivity issues. So that's just another example of where accessibility best practices are also just a best practice and provide a great experience for all of your visitors. That's something we're going to bring back as a theme throughout a lot of this conversation here today. But also want to just unpack what we mean by proper alt text here. So the most helpful way to think about this is there are kind of buckets of images. There are different kinds of images that serve different purposes on your website. One type of image is informational, where the image conveys information that is important to a visitor understanding what you're talking about. By contrast, some images are decorative and less essential to folks understanding that page content. So let's actually look at an example of each of those, informational images versus decorative images, and talk about how to approach alt text with both. So here's a screenshot from one of our blog posts. This blog post is all about defining key website design vocabulary. And one of the terms we cover is responsive design. So there's some text written on the page that defines what responsive design is. Responsive design is just what design responds to the screen it's viewed on, or changes size to adapt to the screen. And in addition to the written definition here, the image is important. It helps to illustrate what that actually looks like in practice. And so we want folks, even if they can't see the image, to understand the information that's being conveyed. And so, that's why we have the alt text here, a laptop, a tablet, and a cell phone, showing how the same website adapts to different screen sizes. Again, we just want to make sure that even if someone can't see that image, or if the image doesn't load, that they can understand the information contained in the image, since it is so important illustrating the point we're trying to illustrate here with this image. Now, contrast that with another example here. This is from the about page of one of our clients, about my sister's business. And they're using this yellow icon from their logo as an icon just within their page content. You can see it's used here for decoration. It looks nice. They're using it multiple places on the page to just highlight some of their headings and reinforce their branding, but it's not serving an informational or functional purpose. There's no text in it. It's not illustrating anything specific to the content. It's not clickable, not a link, it's not a button. It's just purely a decorative image. It is not important to a visitor's understanding of what's happening on this page. And so they could technically do what's called using an empty alt attribute. It's just a fancy way of saying, essentially telling screen readers that they can skip over that image. They don't need to provide any alt text for that particular. And to any of our clients or folks that are using WordPress, if you leave the alt text blank, that'll tell screen readers to skip over the image when conveying the meaning of the page. Now, if you're using a different content management system, it's going to depend on the nuances of your tool. So you could ask your developer how to, again, it's called using an empty alt attribute, but in a lot of modern CMSs, if you do the alt text blank, that'll be a signal to skip over it. Now, there are a lot of considerations that go into writing and using alt text. And so we put together this decision tree flowchart to help work through it all. We're not going to walk through all of it because there are a bunch of sort of like yes, no logic that you can use here to decide what type of alt text, or if you even need alt text, you should be using. And so we'll share a link to this in the chat. That way you can grab a copy and you can actually just refer back to this as you're publishing images, making updates on your website. So yeah, Nikki dropped that in the chat. Feel free to grab a copy. You don't need to put in an email address or anything. You can just grab a free copy of that. Now, in terms of how you actually add alt text to an image, this will also vary depending on your website tool. Here's a screenshot of how it works in the back end of our websites. It'll be pretty similar, most likely, if you're using WordPress in general. But the way you do it here is you actually click on the image. You'll see in the right-hand sidebar under settings, there's this box that says alternative text. We've highlighted it there in red. And you actually just put your alt text in there. Or again, you leave it blank if it's just a decorative image. And then when you update the page or publish the page, that alt text will be in the code associated with that image. That is all about alt text. Next up here, the next tip here is don't bury text within your images. So this is actually one of the most common issues we see with accessibility images that include text. Like a lot of times there's a flyer on an event page that invites folks to an upcoming gala, or maybe it's a brochure or a one-pager about one of the programs or a service or something like that. While these images can look nice, they're generally not very accessible. And alt text can only convey so much information, especially when you're generally trying to write a pretty brief description of the image itself. So let's look at an actual example here. Here's an invite to our 5th annual Giving Gala. I try to switch between gala and gala, so I know people have opinions on that. Try and make sure that we can make everyone happy with that. And don't worry, this is a made-up organization. We are not roasting a real nonprofit here. But pretend like this was embedded on an event page on our website. This is going to be problematic for a few reasons. So first, folks with screen readers just aren't able to access all the detailed information that's tied up in this image. But beyond that, it's actually just more difficult for most visitors. So for a few reasons, tying up text in photos doesn't lend itself to site search. There's a way for people to search your website. It's also not great from a search engine optimization standpoint because those tools actually rely on the words on your page to make sense of what the page is about. So by pulling that content off the page, putting it into an image, you're just robbing those tools of a lot of the context that they need to be effective. Um, this also doesn't generally work well, like we said before, for folks with poor internet connection who aren't able to load images. A lot of times these images just won't load and they'll miss out on a lot of the important information that's in here about how to RSVP and when the event is and all of that kind of information. And it can also be difficult for visitors who are on a small screen, like their phone. A lot of times images will get really small, text will get really difficult to read. So, in terms of how we fix that, we always recommend just pulling the text out of the image and entering it directly on the page. So, you can see here there's no text in our image. And as a result, it can actually be accessed by screen readers and assistive devices. It can be crawled by search engines. It can be crawled by our website search. Um, now, this is something we see a lot of organizations do. So if you've used this approach before, no judgments. You are not alone. Um, it's a pretty simple update. It can go a long way towards making your site more accessible. So to fix this, what we recommend doing is just reviewing your pages and looking for images that have text in them. Some common areas to look for: look at the event section of your site, program pages, and impact pages are three sort of common areas that we see images with text rolled into them. And then instead of including text within the image, enter that text as content around the image that supports what's shown in the image itself. All right. Similar to that point, we also always recommend offering captions for videos or a transcript for any audio content on your site. This is, again, generally a pretty easy way to make your site more accessible. Without a text alternative, a lot of folks end up just excluded from this type of content. Certainly, folks who are deaf or hard of hearing are practically unable to access this kind of content, as well as those just that struggle with auditory processing in general won't be able to make sense of the content that you're sharing through those mediums. And then there's also just visitors who aren't in a position to listen to the audio for whatever reason, or maybe they don't have headphones, they're in a loud space. So by providing that text alternative, all of these folks have a much easier time accessing this content. This is also something that's much better for search engine optimization, again, because it's content that can be crawled, can be indexed, and can give search engines an idea of what the page is about if you're actually putting that transcript on the page for search engines to crawl. So where do you start here? We always recommend just review your videos. Some tools like YouTube can apply auto captions automatically. A lot of social media sites will do this as well. Auto captions are definitely better than nothing. It's a great place to start, but I always recommend just taking a quick pass through those automatically generated captions and making sure that there's no typos, make sure that punctuation makes sense, capitalization makes sense, just to provide a solid experience for people that are engaging with the videos. Just taking a couple of minutes to manually clean up those captions, it's usually pretty quick. Just give it a quick read. It can go a really long way, especially now that so many people are viewing videos on their phones or it can really be it can be a low lift, high leverage way to get more out of your video. Um, the other thing we like to mention is if you are using tools that are not automatically generating captions, there are tools that will create transcripts, create captions for you, so you don't have to manually type all of that out. We use a tool called Descript. We'll drop links in the comments here, but the tool Descript, we use it for a lot of video content. It has a pretty generous free plan, which is nice, and it can generate pretty solid transcripts, pretty solid captions. And then another tool is called Rev, which isn't too expensive. We've in the past We'll drop links for both of those in the chat here so you can check those out. And then would also recommend, in addition to videos, doing the same thing for audio clips, generating a transcript, usually relatively inexpensive using AI these days, and then just go in, do a little bit of cleanup before sharing it on the page. So that can be a really helpful way to just get more, provide a better experience and get more benefit from the video content that you're creating. Next up, use headings in the order they're intended. Using headings throughout your content makes it easier for folks to scan and follow new ideas as they're introduced. Plus, they just make your page look a whole lot nicer instead of just a big wall of text. But your website's headings aren't just for looks. Like heading levels. So we're talking about like heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and so on. You'll hear them called H1, H2, H3 for short. They're a primary way that folks using assistive devices will actually navigate through content. So mixing up the heading structure won't just be visually confusing. It also actually makes understanding your content much more difficult for someone who has a disability and is using an assistive device. So to make your site more accessible, use your headings in the order that they're intended to be used. We'll sometimes call this a heading hierarchy. So H1 or heading 1 first, H2, H3, H4, etc. So let's look at a quick example just to illustrate this point. So here's a page where the heading structure is all mixed up. You can see the page jumps from heading 1, where it says conference, straight to our H3, our heading 3 style, then back up to heading 2 for available session, then back up to H1 or heading 1 for session 1. It's just confusing from a information hierarchy standpoint. But it will be especially difficult for folks who are using a screen reader or an assistive device. It'll just make it really tough to get kind of an overview of what the page is about, and also make it tough for them to jump to the appropriate place on the page that they're interested in. So instead, here's an example that's a little bit cleaner. You can see the headings follow a logical order. So the page is created. Title is almost always going to be your H1, your heading 1. And you should only have one H1 on a page. And then your next heading will be an H2. In this case, that's event highlights. And then we have another section that is a distinct area of the page, a distinct type of content. So we use another H2 to show available sessions. And then session 1 is sort of a sub available sessions. And so we drop down a level to our H3. Now you can see here, it's okay to repeat headings of the same type. So we have, 2 H2s in a row. That is totally fine because those are distinct sections of the page. But we wouldn't want to jump, from an H2 straight to an H4. That's the kind of thing that would be potentially confusing for visitors and for assistive folks that are using assistive devices. All right. So the next one here, avoid over formatting your text. What do we mean by over formatting? We're talking about too much all caps or bold text or italicized text. It's really easy to think that all caps or bolding text is going to be a great way to grab visitors' attention, but it presents a bunch of issues with accessibility. So all caps can be a lot harder for all your visitors to read, but it can definitely be especially tough for folks that have a visual or a cognitive impairment. It can also be tough on screen readers. Sometimes they'll actually just read the letters instead of the words because it comes across as an acronym or something like that. Use all caps very sparingly. And then another example is italicized text can sometimes be especially difficult for your readers that have dyslexia, just because the slanted letter shapes can make it more difficult to keep straight what's exactly happening with your content. And the other thing to keep in mind is the whole point of this, these formatting choices are to add emphasis. And as you're overusing them, it really undercuts the value of that. So here's an example. You can see it pretty clearly in action. We've gone a little maybe overboard here to illustrate the point, but this is not all that uncommon, to be honest with you, where we see entire paragraphs in all caps. We see a lot of bold text. It just makes it tough to read quickly. It makes it tough to skim. It makes it tough to know what the key points of the page are. and again, can be especially difficult for folks that have disabilities or are using an assistive device of some sort. So instead, in general, you want to aim for clean, simple formatting that enhances readability for all your users. There's definitely a balance between just a plain page that's a wall of text and a page that's overly formatted and too tricky to read. So, what we recommend doing is review your pages, remove unnecessary caps, remove unnecessary bolding, italicized text, avoid big blocks of text that have those um, characteristics. And then, if you use them, just use them as sparingly as possible to really add emphasis to the points that you're trying to draw attention. That can really help all of your visitors have the best experience possible. Next up, use descriptive link text to make your website more accessible. So here, you basically want to tell visitors what they can find on the other side of clicking a link. And really, we want to avoid click here links at all costs, where the link says click here or learn more. So why does this matter? Many folks using screen readers will actually tab through the links on a page to just skim the content and sort of find the section that they're looking for on your website. And when all your links say click here or learn more, it becomes really hard for folks to distinguish between links and find what they're looking for. And then the other thing is click here just lacks clarity. It doesn't give visitors a clear idea of what to expect on the other side of that click, which actually just makes it less likely they'll click in the first place. And as a bonus benefit here, using descriptive link text is also much better when it comes to optimizing your site for search from a SEO, from a search engine optimization perspective. So in terms of how you fix this, how much time this takes will depend on just how widespread those click here links are around your website. But you can just start by being more mindful of this as you're creating new pages and updating pages on your site. Just look for any links, make sure that you're avoiding click here, learn more. And usually you can do this by just kind of flipping the sentence around a little bit to avoid that type of link. So let's say hypothetically you're putting a link on a page to invite visitors to donate. That's a pretty common call to action that people are putting on a page. Rather than saying click here at the end of a sentence that talks about making a donation, just flip it. And you might say something like, make a gift to support our work, make a gift to change lives, or whatever. Sub out that last part to make it specific to your mission. But by actually making that the link, you're just connecting dots for visitors between the page that they're on and that next step in their journey. So they know what they're going to find when they click that link. They're going to find a way to make a gift to support your work. And the last one here, finally, another simple way to make your site more inclusive, accessible, is to turn off autoplay for videos and audio clips. Anything that starts playing on its own when a visitor lands on your site. Now, why does this matter so much for accessibility? We've already talked about this some, but screen readers communicate page content through audio. So when a video or an audio clip starts playing automatically right away, often will overlap with the audio that's being output by a screen reader. That can be incredibly challenging for a visitor who's relying on that screen reader to make sense of your website. And then it's typically much easier for someone to activate a video or an audio clip when they're ready to play it than it is to locate the source of audio after it's already playing. You've probably experienced this yourself at some point where you're in a quiet space and you accidentally start blasting the audio from a video or an audio clip. Probably just know how irritating that can be. It's providing a really negative experience for most of your visitors. So instead, whenever you possibly can, include a way to manually start the videos. Don't autoplay them, turn off that setting, allow visitors to manually play video or audio when they're ready. It's going to provide a much better user experience overall, but especially for folks that are using an assistive device to engage with your content. And that is it. Now you know 7 easy no-code ways that you can make your website more accessible for all of your visitors, and just show them that everyone is welcome as part of your movement. And if nothing else, as you publish new content or make changes to your pages, as you publish on social media, just get in the habit of pausing for a second and asking yourself, have I considered how accessible this is for folks who have disabilities? It's amazing how that quick moment of pause and reflection can go a really long way when it comes to making your websites more welcoming for all of your visitors.